I'm struggling with democracy because I'm not an anarchist. The alternative to democracy to me is tyranny, or it's anarchy, which has never existed and will never work. Or communism. Like, it's all these other shit things.
Yeah.
So democracy to me is like the best shit version, to paraphrase with curse language, Churchill, it's the best shit version that we have, but it's so broken. I'm not voting.
Well, I think, as an ancient historian, and this is another thing, another collaborator on The Blind Spot is Tim Ferguson, who runs the Anacyclosis Institute. So I'm going to shout out to him. And Anacyclosis is like currently, so I try to be quite neutral in my politics, really. And even though like lots of people on the left think I agree with them on lots of things, and people on the right think I agree, but actually I'm fairly distributed. But that's because my mindset about politics is from the anacyclosis perspective. And the anacyclosis perspective is a Polybian theory about cyclical political systems. And that, actually it's very rare what we've had the last 100 years or more. Democracy is actually, specifically in the last 100 years, the kind of like wealth effect that we've had as a result of democracy in the post-war environment. But the democracy itself, institutionally over thousands of years that we've had it, is frankly, actually Poland was one of the first democracies in Europe. To just bring out all my biases, we had a noble democracy, so it's slightly different, but that's why I say thousands of years. But the problem with it is that it is a solution based on cyclical principles, right? And if it can't swing, because one of those, so essentially, anacyclosis is the theory that everything gets corrupted eventually. Okay. So you start off with like, let's say the proto-original model is the benign monarch or the benign, the philosopher king, right? So that's great until there's a succession, because you don't know who the child's going to be, right? So in that case, what happens if it's a tyrant? And even if you have a good, run of 13 generations of a nice king, at some point you're going to get a tyrant. So monarchy is not brilliant. It's definitely not protected from corruption and having a tyrant. But once a tyrant emerges, usually it swings to the next phase, which is a benign oligarchy. So there's a coup against the mad king, a la Game of Thrones. Yeah. And then they kind of secretly kind of manage things. But they too get corrupted, at which point there's a revolution. So the example of that is sort of France and the kind of aristocratic system and the concord between the head of state and the aristocracy. We also had that in the UK. And then there's a revolution and you have mass democracy, and that's great as well, or, a good form of mass rule, but then that gets corrupted and you end up in mob rule, or you end up with a situation can swing the other way where there's a coup and there's a return to autocracy. But sometimes a benign autocrat emerges as well, in which case, this is where we are, and this is, I think, it speaks to your dilemma. Is a bad democracy better or worse than a benign and good dictator, at least on a temporary basis? And I think I had a massive argument with David Gerard, who I'm sure you know who he is.
Mm-hmm. Attack of the 50-foot
blockchain. And I'm a big fan of David's, and I think he's exceptionally well researched, and he is generally a good egg. Even if I disagreed with him on this one issue, but we were discussing El Salvador. And I'm not an expert in El Salvador, and I will definitely put my hands up and say I'm not an expert. But I've read a little bit about it, and I know there's history there. They've had a very tumultuous recent past. Everything, the way I know went into El Salvador's history, or the way I was exposed to it, was through a book by a Polish author called Ryszard Kapuscinski, who wrote about the soccer war, which was you would love.
I know that I've got that book. That's between Honduras and El Salvador, isn't it?
Yes, and it was the civil war. It wasn't a civil war. It was a very brief, maybe 2-week war that emerged because of some penalty. No, they didn't get into the finals, I don't think, but they were playing each other off, and what happened is that there was a lot of politics before that. I think there was land migration and like El Salvadorians had moved to Honduras. It was all very complicated, but they were playing each other and Honduras team came to play, or vice versa. Anyway, they came to play in El Salvador and they got, the El Salvadorians went to play in Honduras and the Hondurans were very loud outside their window, so the team couldn't sleep. And as a footballer, I'm sure you'd appreciate that.
It's a great tactic. they used to do. Who did they do that to? Was it like Man City or somebody? They did it to a hotel. They set the alarms off for a cup final. Like it's an old tactic.
It goes back to the 60s, the soccer war, and of course El Salvador lost. And there was a massive outcry because they thought it was unfair. And some girl committed suicide and it became very, very emotional. And then Honduras had to play their match and the El Salvadorians did exactly the same thing to them. And then the Honduras team lost. And on their way back to Honduras, they were like, something's going to go down. It's just going to go down. And then like within days or even a night, I'm sorry if I'm getting my history wrong as a historian, there was an attack and the El Salvadorians attacked Honduras and it was like a 7-day or 10-day war. It was really awful and very bloody and lots of people died. And it was, a precedent to the madness that has ensued in El Salvador ever since, which has always been like in the grips of some sort of tyrannical coup or like a military junta or whatever, being bankrolled by one Western state or the other, right? And there was like a proxy war between the USSR, I think, and the Americans, kind of basically trying to get edge power into the politics there. And then finally, it was not good. There was a horrible kind of dictatorship, and there were death gangs, not what they call death squads going around, horrific stuff. From that emerged the gangland of MS-13. So all I said to David Gerard, who was very quick to, criticize Bukele, is that I appreciate that he might be going a bit dictatorial, but we don't know the sensibilities of the El Salvadorians. And frankly, in some cases, if you're surrounded by chaos, I can see a situation where a little bit of certainty under a benign leader that you think is on your side makes a hell of a lot more sense than like standing up for democracy, which is never going to get rid of the MS-13 problem or whatever, right? And I just think we need to be a bit more open-minded about...
Well, has David been to El Salvador?
I don't know.
Okay.
Have you?
Yes.
Well, you can tell me more.
5 times. I've interviewed the president twice.
Oh, yes. You did. Yeah. So you can tell me more than anybody.
So it reminds, it's a funny coincidence. It reminds me, like last night, I ended up watching, have you seen the film Gone Baby Gone?
No.
Gone Baby Gone. To explain this, I'm going to have to give you ruin the plot for you. But essentially, a young girl gets kidnapped and goes missing. She's about 4 or 5 years old. The film was meant to be released around the time Madeleine McCann went missing, so it got delayed for a while, actually. But eventually got released. And it was a huge conspiracy, and she ended up being kidnapped by a policeman, Morgan Freeman, who I think his own daughter had died. Mm-hmm. And they were really well-to-do, raised her well. The mum, who she was kidnapped from, was... it was her brother who knew the mum was a crack addict and just a piece of shit mum, and he helped her get kidnapped by the police because he knew this girl would get a proper upbringing. Mm-hmm. They end up finding her and like cracking it and realizing it was the policeman who kidnapped her. And so then the policeman who'd figured it all out went with his wife to visit Morgan Freeman. They see the little girl there and they're like, and his wife says, leave her here. Do not return her to her mother. She's going to have a good upbringing. She's going to have a good life. Yeah. And he's like, but I have to because it wasn't his right to steal her. And so it was this real kind of moral dilemma of the rules say that she should be with her mother because it's kidnapped. But morally, people are questioning, like, but her mum's a crackhead, doesn't care about her. She's a drug dealer. She's just a piece of shit. Little girl's going to have an amazing life. And so they go through that moral dilemma. And like, it makes me think a little bit about the moral dilemma of El Salvador, which I've seen debated because Alex Gladstein, a very good advocate of human rights, works for Human Rights Foundation, has been very critical of President Bukele and the human rights situation with the mass arrest of people who've basically got tattoos. And I totally see his point. But I also see that the murder rate has dropped from something like 110 per 100,000 to 7.8, which is a huge drop. I've been there myself. I've been to a red zone. I've got a tattoo here. I got there. And I met somebody there, and they said, this was pre all these mass arrests. They said, the difference under Bukele is I can use my phone on the street. Previously, I couldn't because it would be snatched from me. The country has undoubtedly got safer, undoubtedly become more of a tourist hotspot. Undoubtedly, there's an increase in the GDP. The country is improving, but it's taken someone who's got kind of dictator tendencies to do this. Now, do I think of him like a Putin or like a more kind of like an evil dictator? No. Do I think of him more of a benevolent dictator? Perhaps. But the population behind him at the moment, he's going to be voted. He's going to win a second election, which is against the constitution. What happens after that? Does he do a third or fourth? What happens when turn? And I don't know. And I question all these things.
Well, this is the thing. This is why I love, in some ways, this is a very long-standing argument in ancient history and philosophical circles, like what is the best form of government? And I don't, we've just assumed democracy is the right answer. And I think by and large, democracy is the right answer. But democracy, the reason democracy works is because it synthesizes all three of those government models. There is a bit of monarchy because we have a prime minister or a president or a head of state. We have a parliament, which is the oligarchy, and then we have the voting part of it, which is the democracy, right? So, in a ideal system, those three complement each other, and it's all like checks and balances on power, and it rotates. And actually, what we've done is we've simultaneously. The usual process is that this, according to Polybius, this cycle continuously evolves, and that when it goes from one point, from the kind of monarchy to the oligarchy to the democracy / mob rule, it's always very destabilizing for economies or for civilizations. But in democracy, we essentially synthesize that transition because we do controlled rotation of that system. And because it's controlled, you should allow for the bad stuff to get sort of shaken out, but without the destabilizing effects. That's why when it becomes very, when you can't have transition of power very smoothly, and it's interesting that we are talking on the day that Trump is about to be arrested, allegedly.
Yes.
I'm sorry if it dates the program, but if you can't have that transfer of power in a smooth way, then you end up with a destabilization. And democracy itself is probably beyond like saving. And I think what I've noticed these days is that in our democratic systems, you're either in power or you're in prison. And that is usually the sort of characteristic of, say, the developing world or, Latin America. The idea is like, you're in power, and you then put your enemy, the former president then goes to prison because you're so polarized, you hate each other so much, you can't there is no peaceful transition. But to the real question is, how do we get back to a system which allows for that peaceful resolution and for democracy to flow again? And I think the reason, and this is my last point because I'm talking a lot.
No, you meant to talk a lot. This is that's how it's not just people prefer interviews than discussions because they don't want me to talk as much.
No. I want to know more about your Bukele experience. It sounds fascinating. But the point is when you can't transfer power easily, you end up with. Now I've lost my train of thought.
It's the transfer of power.
I was going to make a really impressive point and I've forgotten. I hate it when that happens. Something probably to do with anisocosis.
Yeah, you were saying if there isn't a smooth transfer of power.
Yes, so if that's it. So why is there no longer a smooth transfer of power? Because the process has, in my opinion, been corrupted because we don't have a fair. I don't mean this in the Trump sense, but I mean it in the sense of lobby groups, in terms of like who really has influence over the politicians, like who really has influence. Like the one thing about Trump that I had to agree with is when he stood up there and said, well, I know they're corrupt because I paid them. And I was like, well, I can't argue with that.
Yeah.
That's a point that is essential. And I think this is very true. And I think that is fundamentally the issue, is that when politicians come in to office just so that they can later make their money out of what they've done in office, that is not a good model.
Well, that's the entire US model,
Exactly.
which the UK model feels like it's slipping into. I think Matt Hancock really exposed that by saying, I'm going to go on, I'm a celebrity, and then I'm going to release a book, which by how naive was he to have, I can't remember, you'll know her name is a ghostwriter.
Isabella Oakeshott.
That's it. I'm not a huge fan of hers, but to have her as a ghostwriter and give her all your text messages was unbelievably naive.
The madness of that is, what was he thinking?
Well, I have no idea, but I mean, the key point is he went to monetize his position as a...
Yeah, but he could have got any ghostwriter. Why do you, she was a known lockdown critic who is married to Richard Tice, the head of the Reform Party, his competition. What was he thinking?
I know, she must have said, I've got all his fucking text messages.
Well, either that or he was doing a Columbo.
I don't know. I don't think he's particularly intelligent, Matt Hancock. Personally, I've never been.
He went to
particularly...
Oxford, didn't he?
Yeah, but there's university intelligence. There's grade. I don't have grade intelligence, but there is also common sense intelligence. I just don't think he particularly is. I think during the whole COVID. I mean, do you remember that video of him stood next to that lady looking all weird from the hospital? But he's. I would think you would argue he was halfway through his political tenure and decided to monetize it. The incentives were so strong for him to make money, he went and did it. After a very unsuccessful tenure during lockdown, where he was highly criticized, and that's the point, is that it's too easy to monetize it. By the way, which I think there's a solution for. I think we should pay politicians much more money.
Yep.
I think they're vastly underpaid for the role they do. People complain about politicians. I think we should pay them a fortune so they don't go and monetize it elsewhere.
No,
and
I
so
agree.
people want to do the job.
And also, who wants to even be a politician these days? I mean, there is no upside to being a politician. And your personal life is on, full, display to everybody. You can't, the idea of it is just appalling to me. I really don't know why you'd want to do it. It's actually a sacrifice nowadays to be a politician, and therefore, so there's an adverse selection because the wrong people become politicians.
Well, it's narcissists. It's a breeding ground for narcissism.
Yeah.
And psychos.
Yeah, because there are, and to be fair, there are a few good politicians who I think do it for the right reasons, but they're very rare.